Good afternoon and welcome. And I'm delighted to welcome you on the occasion of this workshop focusing on digital technology at the service of construction industry and economists of constructions for a variety of types of buildings. We have a panel with the digital transition plan for buildings representative. We have the Asian construction director, Pascal Asselin, chair of avec, Tamus, president of the European Committee of the EC. So the last year, digital was a theme we tackled. That was last year. And we mentioned, we talked a lot about energy transition, environmental transition, and digital technology. So obviously, digital technology playing a driving force in our business, in our jobs, in our professions, in the industry, for the clients. So what is the state of ownership in the construction sector that you know well? Well, thank you very much, and good afternoon. On behalf of the TNB, we strive year on year to appreciate through surveys the evolution of digital technologies. The last one at the start, that took place at the start of 2018, covering over 300,000 people who have been surveyed. Well, fewer have responded, not that many in actual fact. We got 1,400 respondents, and so all categories included, there's a bit of everything. We have so clients, project managers, businesses, economists, most likely industrial players. Out of this whole set, 35% of responses are like BIM, we know, we do this, we apply it, we know what it's about. 35%. So compared with 2014, we hadn't run any surveys then, but we wouldn't have found it very difficult to exceed the 1% mark. So in France, within a matter of a few years, we went from very low signals to 35%. So, and those who respond are those with the most interest or most interested. So it's not necessarily representative, but out of a panel of 1,400, 30% is significant. And with differences there, those more into BIM and digital are project managers, architects, first and foremost. That's the way it should be. And these are those at the in the front line in terms of the interest of using digital modeling from the start of the program to share their projects with the client and the project manager and with the teams involved in the technical studies and design studies. So project managements accounting for 50%. These tools lend themselves well to engineering of all kinds. Now, as to the project managers, it's really important to and clients have the key. They can decide to. They're the ones who decide to get in there to give the go ahead to impose the BIM to their team. So, we're talking about 24% or a quarter of those respondents are aware of these, and this is to be put in perspective with another study is carried out by the Order of Architects. And, that was published 3 months ago, and indicating that 8 to 15% of public procurement project management is now embarked in the BIM, imposing BIM in their tendering process. So this is, we're talking about 4 separate batches of programs, 7 to 8%. And I think This is the first step forward, and 15% when we aggregate and the sort of global market. So we have businesses in the building industry. We're probably talking under 10% of businesses, notably in the SMEs. So small businesses, we're happy when we find, and if some have used the digital technologies and BIM. So it's kind of depending on the size of the businesses, and one of your missions is to support small players size-wise, but not small in ambition, in terms of ambitions. It's precisely to help them to get them started off in terms of the digital technologies. That was the main objective. The main objectives of PTNB, which was sought after by the PTNB and the state, was to prevent the digital fracture, for SMEs to be sidelined, and so we wanted to focus our surveys on these mass targets by offering them opportunities to support initiatives aiming at constructing newly built in using digital technologies and BIM. And we selected some of the short projects: construction, renovation, management, maintenance in BIM, using BIM. So we've exceeded the 70 project mark. So with small-size projects driven by small entities across the territories, supported by the PTNB. So we're now going to look into these feedback in the next few months, as to communicate this across a very vast professional audience, and with questions related to the tools, the skills. And we've worked on that as well. So there are many, many tools around. There's a growing number of tools, but are these adapted to the SMEs? So we've worked, notably 2 years ago, we ran a competition and targeting software editors, and we rewarded those tools that were most adapted to small businesses, as these are cheap tools, easy to use. You don't need to train for weeks on end to learn to use these software. We can build. There's a learning curve there, and software editors have understood this, that it was high expectations there, and skills. Well, for small businesses, there has to be a development of a training offering that's adapted to these players. This is what we see developing. We have a PTNB website. We've listed over 500 training offerings, and targeting BIM offered to small end users, and several organizations have taken their, positioned themselves on these markets. So we need to look at the overall pictures. There might be some good and not so good things in all these. It is the role of the states and professionals to regulate this emerging market. Gilles CHARBONNEL. So it is almost the anniversary of the creation of your professional organizations with aim at digitizing the construction industry. So we bring together 12 professional organizations. We've been around for a year now. To quickly the point in that within the framework of these 12 organizations, we represent the whole ecosystem of constructions. So FAB, CAPEB, EGF, BTP for businesses, UNGE, and TEG, Sinofficia for project management, CNCC and FIEC for industrial players, and FEI, and USH for the clients. All players in the construction industries across the various steps. So we want to develop an ecosystem, experimenting, leveraging what has been done through the PTNB. Many initiatives, as Bertrand explained, have been initiated. So, and most importantly, is where we want to head, and making sure that all players can just develop their skills. So we're talking about SMEs, small businesses, but when we look a bit more closely, everybody at some point have been exposed to digital technologies, not full BIM, but within their own functions in their own business. They've included that BIM functions can be visualization for the private developer. For commercials, this is more related to stock management. For businesses, can be for structural works and management of steel structures, prefab works management. So we can clearly find all players have indeed found a point in using digital technologies. It's about scaling up their skills so as to develop a kind of collaborative model with an experimental approach or not. Because these days we have a tool that is Croquis, a platform on which we can exchange, we can find tools. So ADN is here to make sure that everybody, well, it's about finding a common language for everybody to communicate easily and exchange readily. So we finally, it's not about finally working collaborative mode, as this was already the case, and it is more embarking on a more iterative mode. It's easier to exchange, the easier it is to develop a more iterative approach, and that is our approach at ADN. And we've also worked on benchmarks and contractors' charters, project management, project ownership, and we need to have exchange charters across the various players to identify expectations in terms of deliverables. What's happening now? Pascal, what is your view on the level of ownership of players in the construction business at AdTech? You have a proactive approach to digital. You edit a MOOC. You're proactive on BIM modeling, and it was a full workshop there. Yesterday, you represent construction businesses, but from not a quantitative but qualitative point this time, you represent territories. It's about enriching. How do players take ownership, and what is their approach, a cultural approach with digital technologies? So we are, there are 8,000 construction economists in France, according to the National Statistics Institute. Well, conversely, it is the largest. Surprisingly enough, these are not the largest players that use the BIM. We have we have very small entities with sole traders that use BIM. It's quite surprising, and so because Tamo is a specialist of BIM, and indeed, it's not about the size. It's not size-driven. So they are groups of people working together So we focused on this topic quite a number of years ago. There was a Congress in Biarritz maybe 5 years ago. The whole Congress was turned to BIM. So more than 5 or 7 years ago. So a Swiss colleague is setting things right. Okay. So we focused on BIM. We then run one-on-one training, general trainings. For example, a consultancy firm went through a training focusing on this new paradigm. Then we fine-tuned our tools with the PNB. We engaged in all of these, and we developed our first MOOC. And we estimated these initiatives have gone on. From an original estimate of 1,500 users, we've reached 7,000 now. So the MOOC has been a pretty successful project. So it is now popularized. So after the first surprise effect, at times people are quite reluctant to new technologies, what's going to be happening, but you are changing the paradigms. Our professions have changed. I don't even know whether in 10 years down the line, my job will be as it is today. We always try to be proactive. No other options.
Le degré d'appropriation du numérique dans les différentes filières de la construction en Europe.
Thomas, Evelyn, you have a European view on things, international vision. What is the degree of ownership taking of digital work across the various branches of constructions in Europe? So you know France well, Nordic countries, you work in Helsinki, you're an expert of BIM as chair of the CEC, a Europe Committee of Constructions, you have this whole international view.
Yeah, I'm working in an infrastructure sector, and for example, infrastructure sector is quite new in BIM. We are just developing the infrastructure BIM. I think now vision in whole Europe is that both infrastructure and construction sector, they are going to BIM. There has been published just EU BIM task handbook, which says that actually public owners has a big role to get the infrastructure to the BIM, get to BIM to use in every country. So I think it starts with the public owners, and then the industries coming also very fast. Did I answer your question?
We can also talk about, we're talking about digital, obviously. What's key is the BIM and digital technologies, digital modeling. What about 3D printing in buildings? What about the blockchain technologies, the notion of data, smart data for mobility in urban areas, virtual reality, artificial intelligence, all of these evolutions, that's what Pascal said. There was a notion of evolutivity, the evolution related to digital revolution, and then all of these micro revolutions. What's happening there in terms of the degree of ownership taking, or in the field of constructions in terms of BIM modeling, but also in terms of virtual realities, blockchain, 3D printing, and artificial intelligence and smart data, for instance, because this is the ecosystem of the digital technology that is really disruptive to several professions, bank, music, and construction necessarily, right?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. We are going through a digitalization, very massive digitalization, which contains very many different technologies. There, like you said, blockchain or different measurement tools. I think if we don't get that handled, organized, we are in problems because there is more and more digital data, more and more people using it in different ways. We have to understand what we are using. We have to understand that when we create information, that we can also handle it now and in future. I think nowadays construction industry is losing lots of information during the life cycle, and I think that there is a big possibility to get more productivity with that, just using the data we sometimes have created to the different purposes. Actually, digitalization, building information model, they are only tools to make better cooperation.
Pascal, what about the other disruptions in terms of 3D printing, blockchain, artificial intelligence? I'm no expert. We've talked about this at length. As indeed an interest for these topics. Things are on the move. The day before yesterday, this is something I discussed with Bertrand Velcrambe. We met up for a press conference for an insurance that is offering cybersecurity on work sites. Very interesting topic, something that would have been unimaginable a few years back. And well, when I saw the roadshow of AD in construction for the real BIM mock-up right at the back of the exhibition hall, I said, well, it would be good for us to have an insurer the day the model runs into, well, conflict. It means that working in silo that we've done forever. These things are moving now. Things are changing, and quite significantly so. And I'm in favor of, I'm pushing for, training, initial training. I think there should be a common curriculum for the promotion of initial training in engineering. So kind of, at least we could have a common foundation, training-wise. Maybe a kind of common training for 2 years, 3 years post-baccalaureate. Plus we have the elite business schools that have that as well. This movement will amplify, will become bigger and bigger. We've had 2 or 3 business schools, engineering schools as issues were either commercial, technological, but it's all going to merge. We have experts in surveying projects and urban spatial development. We have a startup that models what we call them the registrars, the land registrars, and within that you have data. You can click on these. You know what your permit rights are, all your urbanistic constraints are listing. Can you imagine the impact in terms of feasibility of projects? Plus, they have control over data, so they have a role to play. That's only the start. Mr. CHARBONNEL, on the projects you've been working on, and as part of your experimenting or studying, what's happening? Well, there's a real shift in society, and we know that there's an ecosystem of buildings. So we're talking about scheduling, using of buildings. All this ecosystem is now changing. It is a change at the level of the whole society. And BIM is more on software, on the software side, on the IT side. These days, we need training, as Pascal stated earlier, far more cross-cutting training. There's this collaborative and iterative side. Everybody needs to have a perception of a horizontal perception, a more vertical perception of this mode of construction. So indeed, there's a real change within society. There are people in our consultancy firms that will need to remodel, transform.
former et transformer.
I think the value chain, as it's designed today, this will, it's very tailorized, but these iterative changes will not be limited to project management. Will have feedback from manufacturers, more direct feedback experience, and startups are working on that. Maintenance of tools, of installed equipment. So there's a host of artificial intelligence is another one. In terms of calculations, computations, analysis, we're talking about insurance and risk analysis. In terms of pathology of buildings, we talked about newly built. We haven't talked about renovation, but digital technology has a bright future ahead. When it comes to building industry, we can see that the visible side of the iceberg, that's what we see now, but there's so much more to be done. It's real disruption, and you will, manage that. It's not like the disc industries, and many disappeared. New models have appeared, and beyond that, the point is experimenting, iterative applications, and we're talking about SMEs earlier. I do think that indeed they are means, resources, investments may be more limited in some of these SMEs, but there is an appetite from part of small businesses to use digital technologies, and we're all immersed in that. And I was on the other side of the rooms. We all have our eyes riveted on our iPhones. We've been really immersed in this digital. We've been captured by digital technologies, and everybody has a smartphone in their pockets on the work side. So when we tell them, well, the detail of this building is on your smartphone, there will be no. We'll fully, we'll be heading to a fully digital society. So what about Bertrand Delcambre to put in place a collaborative platform on BIM, right? I won't come back to that, but Gilles stated, as part of the TNB, we opted for the, the implementation of a tool called a collaborative platform, referred to as ROCI, which development was entrusted with CSTB. This has been available for a few months. And the thing is, the point is to make this freely available to those that haven't made that step into that technology. Okay, those who say, well, it's expensive, it's complicated to use. We wanted to provide a simple-to-use tool. Professionals define the technical specs of the tool. So a user-friendly tool, so as for people to get started using digital technologies. So what happens? But we've already got about 6,000 subscribers, 2,000 actual users, and about several hundreds of projects using this platform. So I think we targeted right to head towards the right technologies. This platform is compatible with a multiplicity of jobs, from calculations, computations to drawing. It is open to software editors. There's been 2 calls for proposals. About 15 software editors were selected, shortlisted, and so this really meets the significant needs of all of the sectors. So that's a good thing. What did I want to say about this? I'd like to come back to 2 points. digital technology is not an end in itself. It is a means to an end. It is a tool. So what can this be used for? So the main priority these days in the building world is the energy renovation. This is a major objective in the building world. And we need to think as to how digital technologies can be useful to the energy renovation. And there's a host of possibilities for diagnosis phases, the pre-works design studies. We'll have fantastic digital tools allowing to design very quickly full digital models of a building using scanners, drones. There's an array of tools that allow to do very powerful stuff. And the study phase, we have very powerful computation tools working out scenarios. We can demultiply creativity. And phases of building works, you mentioned 3D printings, robotics, exoskeletons. That's really there. All that is here. And focusing on the intelligence of digital technologies, so driving efficiencies. Beyond that, we have digital tools allowing to make sure that we've done a good job. And on deliveries, we can measure the performance of buildings with new software. And then once we've done that, we can also create digital tools and evaluate the performance and monitoring, managing installations. So digital technologies is to be seen under that particular light. It's a puzzle approach. It is then composed over time as time goes by, and digital models and are subject to project managers to contribute. This could be interfaced with IoT, connected objects, the Internet of Things, at the service of a better construction projects. Can reconcile with projects when it comes to analysis of life cycles to better phase the various phases at the service of project managers and final clients and users.
So that's an evolution with the connected object that can be interfaced with all of this. This could be a way to be more efficient, more productive, and to do savings. This is what we said during the workshops. There's a label that exists already. It's been here for 6 months, so we're going to determine the weight of the carbon footprint. A few years back, doing that was possible, but it was a whole lot of money of work, and what did I want to say? Well, our main partner in the end is the customer, because we could find anything and everything, but the final user will be the customer. And if the idea is to save time, obviously the entrepreneur will find the solution. So the idea is also to conceive what the final usage will be. And today, when we work, for instance, on digital markups on BIM, the customer will require plans, and this is a reflex, and this is normal, this is quite human, and things will change in time. So that's there's a necessity to train also project managers. Yes, indeed. Maybe Bertrand could try and generate discussions on this, but in my job, what's frustrating is that not everybody is trained. That's not the case with me. All my employees are trained, but I don't have any requests. It is quite symptomatic. Yes, indeed, it is. Some customers, all of those that truly exploit their buildings, are getting into it. They're making the tools theirs. They're trying to use them. And there's also the public sector as well, in which there's still a lot of work to be done. And I do think that they really need to realize that civil servants need to be trained. So here the challenge is to have people trained, including all the project managers. And yes, indeed, I think we mentioned an observatory earlier, and I think that for the offer to match the demand, it is essential, and we need, that's why also we need to contemplate what's happening. Some stakeholders, some project managers do not necessarily know what they can get from this digital modeling. And we, the stakeholders of the building industry, are the ones that should demonstrate the benefits of this digital modeling when it comes to management, operations, orders, interactions, follow-up. There's a real change when it comes to our society on all the phases of construction, and I think that we need to consider the customer to offer them new solutions. Are you carrying out certain actions? Yes, we're trying to do things about it. The idea is not necessarily to launch 1,000 training programs, but we are trying to train people, and we really need to observe what's happening and not just wait in order to have the offer match the demand, but also generate specific offers. When it comes to energy renovations, we have to go even further. We have to consider certain properties. We could say, well, we try to modelize your building, and we now know very quickly what the levels of energy you consume and what you might consume tomorrow. And you can see a few scenarios of investment. That's also an offer that we can present. And I do think that we shouldn't wait to do that. We shouldn't wait for a specific demand. Let's take an example. Tesla never waited for the population, the people, to show a need for an electric car. Pascal Asselin, the biggest player at the moment are startups that didn't exist 15 years ago, and they have a monopoly when it comes to data. So how, and basically big oil companies are not the one at the spearhead of all this. So how can you finance the development of startups? Because the revolution will be generated by these startups. And we can see that many of the groups from the stock option are creating partnerships with startups. So how can you attract startups in the sector? Because they will bring you a gold mine with their know-how, with data, and the added value in the future will reside in data. And in order to better collect, to better manage data, to better integrate them in these digital models, here there's a real challenge in integrating startups. So what can you do? Well, what we can do and what we can see is that the world of construction is becoming attractive again, because there's a certain number of startups that are developing products for the building sector. So the image of the construction sector itself is changing. Bertrand is not going to contradict me on this. I think that about 14 startups are here around the CSTB lab. They have access to data, and there are many startups working with industrialists. And indeed, the digital world can be considered a tool, but we also need some grey matter behind that. And this grey matter can be found in these startups, in the new generation that is blossoming at the moment, that is bringing in new ideas, that is conceiving, designing new things. We do not perceive things the same way as we used to. We transform information now. A few days back, I was listening to a professor. He was saying, well, you read Les Fables de La Fontaine, which is a very famous French book, in a book, on paper, but your children will read it on a tablet, and that's where we stand today. We are trying to use other part of our employees' brains and to trigger new things. To us, it could be a bit more difficult because this is not necessarily our world. Even though we have the two cultures. Earlier we were talking about paper books versus tablets. Remember, before we had smartphones, we had PDAs, personal assistants, you remember? And we also had a real agenda, paper agenda in our suitcase. And we started working on both at some point, and we realized that it was too tedious, so we worked only on the IT device. And this is this is where we stand in the construction sector right now. We're working on both, and at some point there will be a turning point, and we'll start working only in the digital world, and there will be no going back, because today, you use mostly your navigation system when you drive, even though you might have a few maps in your glove compartment, you no longer use it. Use them. Sometimes the navigation system, the sat-nav, might make a few mistakes, but that's not a reason for you to go back to your maps. There are startups that also innovate in their collaborative processes. Bertrand Delcamp, your startup is doing so. Are you trying to support that sort of thing in the sector? Well, one of the reasons why today we see more and more startups in the sector, and we find it baffling, has to do with the fact that we're dealing with an immaterial world. We do not need a factory to invent a new function. This has to do with abstract development using very simple tools. So that's something that anyone can do. It's open to anyone. We open the box of collective creativity, and we are bringing together all the possibilities from these new technologies, bringing them together with the materials that we have at our disposal. And this will continue growing in the future. What struck me was the Energy Future Fair a few weeks ago, and there was an exhibit that was dedicated to startups. And when I accompanied the minister, because he visited the show, he was really astonished by an app, for instance. Even though he's really young, he was astonished by an app that used virtual augmented reality. That he wore the goggles and everything, and he was baffled by what he saw. And the thing is, to do that, we need money, we need passionate people, but still, this is at the tip of our fingers. We don't necessarily need huge investments to do that, and that's what I wanted to say. And I do think that at the end today, and I think that's very important, in the construction sector, people stick together, and they have to stick together. Architects should not, work on their side while economists do their things on their own side. The wealth of PTNB is that it was a collective approach, that people wanted to move forward in the same direction together, and this is what we're going to do. Yes, and that is something that we can feel. And if the stakes are high, there's a responsibility. And the idea is really to work together, depending on your job and your point of view. So we'll be able now to talk about an experimental approach. We will tell you more about Florian Plouilly, who's a construction specialist, a construction expert, who's a member of avec. So this is an experimental approach. Florian, can you come on stage? And you're going to share your expertise. Because during the show, during the fair, you facilitated 4 workshops, and you allowed professionals to co-produce with you a digital model. And this is a real expertise strength here, and you did that very spontaneously, and you are specialized in BIM. Thank you, exactly. This is what I did, indeed. So let's give some feedback on the BIM workshop that we facilitated during this fair. I'm a construction economist and I'm a BIM manager, and since we were talking about trainings, I was trained. I had a master in BIM at École des Ponts and ESTB in Paris, and I also considered the Brits' point of view on this topic and the dimension in which they're going to integrate the clients in this dimension, because the role of the client is going to be the cornerstone of all this. And so this helped me being more mature. It helped me see why we were doing all this. And this is what we tried to convey, the message we tried to convey in the workshop we set up. So we had a lot of conferences. There were many conferences on this issue, which is a traditional issue that is addressed in conferences. And usually what we hear is that people need to see what a digital tablet is, and what inputting some data in a model, a digital model, concretely is. This is what we try to do, and we try to see different things, and the feedback we received was very interesting. So we created a quick exercise that lasted for 45 minutes, and we had the possibility to work on with BIM on a real project, so that the exercise lasted for 45 minutes. So we produced it over and over again for the last few days. So it required a lot of preparation and many things. And there were a huge stand with computers, with internet access, and the idea was to lay the foundations for the message that we want to convey. And indeed, all this requires a lot of preparation, and we had to anticipate this approach. Indeed, the main difference here was that we knew already where we wanted to go and how we would get there and where we would arrive. And we had prepared our subject. So we really insisted on the definitions, the BIM charter of the client, all the documents that designers have to draft for these projects. So this helped us really use the right vocabulary for the BIM project. And we presented software solutions. We tried to make them as transparent as possible. We could have done this using certain softwares or others. We could have gone even further, but still what we did was that we treated applications that concern different jobs, different trade for the same project. So our approach was to start with the reflection of a customer, a contractor, a person, an individual owning a building, and who'd like to consider the operational aspect and the maintenance of the building. So we considered how things, how he could consider the project with his subcontractors, and we showed him how to access the data in the project, and that in, for instance, the design phase, the BIM had a real potential, for instance, when he worked with an architect and so on. So we added many buildings, we added many things to the project. For instance, at some point we added an entire floor and so on. So then we started working on the construction phase with the survey, the preliminary surveys, the costing, and the major part of our role, and this is what we wanted to explain, was that we had to define the characteristics of the construction systems and all the objects that make up our BIM model. This is what we did, and there was there were modifications that were made to the phase that had to be carried out by certain companies. So, and the last thing that we had to do with an industrial phase, and therefore we try and implement all the objects on which development has started. So, to give you some feedback, what we should keep in mind was that we managed to truly convey a message, to give the right definitions, the important words. Here we're not talking about theoretical training. We managed to have them practice. We tried to demystify all this, demystify data. We managed to work on all the phases for the workshop, and in the end, the feedback we received was we need to go even further on certain usage. Why don't you go even further for that sort of phase? For instance, we talked about very ambitious aspects, connected objects, smart cities, 3D scans. All these could be one of the practical aspects of this workshop. And it was actually quite pleasant to see how each person that agreed, to do it, positioned themselves, how they integrated themselves into something that was a sort of school-like exercise. And in the end, they all found they all came to the conclusion that the role, the competences and the responsibilities of each and everyone are the same, whether you're using BIM or not. When you use the BIM, only the time spent to do all the work you're supposed to do changes. You're going to use certain methods and so on. And the idea is really to make the most of the potential offered by the digital world in order to do better a little bit more quickly. I think that the idea was to learn, and it was a real success. And here there was an approach through practice in order to teach people how to use them. People might have been a bit worried about the technical aspect, but in the end, did you feel that it was easy for them to get into it? I don't know if people were really worried when they sat down. Maybe I'm not sure that there were limitations and so on, but I think that at some point we might manage to remove a blockage. At some point we talk about an object, metadata, and you can't really see how much energy is required to work on all that, and we showed them how to work on one object, and once you can do it for one, you can do it for about anything. Do you want to react on the BIM workshop? Well, if you do, don't hesitate. Pascal, you might want to conclude on the issue of the digital world, what you did, what you are going to do. Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you to all the speakers, Gilles, Arnaud, Bertrand, and all our foreign counterparts. There will be more than 50 countries at dinner tonight. There were more than 20 countries here today. 120, sorry. So what could I say? It's the beginning of an adventure. It's not over. Next year, we'll continue on the same path. The Congress will take place on the 20th and 21st of June in Avignon. We'll talk about AI, and maybe we're going to change your minds regarding certain ideas that we started mentioning today, but we have to get into it. Thank you very much, everyone, for keeping up with us and staying so late. Thank you very much.